Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and today we are going to be playing around with our old friend the PPP and learning some fancy tricks. Now, we've seen how the perfect passive, the future perfect passive and the pluperfect passive are all formed using the PPP, the past participle passive. And to that PPP we've added either the present tense of sum, or the future tense of sum, or the imperfect tense of sum. So what's actually happening there is when we say amatus est, we know now that that means he has been loved. But strictly speaking, what it means is he is having been loved. Because the PPP, amatus, literally means having been loved. So, amatus est, he is having been loved. Amatus erit, he will be having been loved. And amatus erat, he was having been loved. Now, we don't translate it like that, of course, but that is what it means. And you need to cling on to that for what we're going to do next. One thing you can do, now that you realise that the tense is formed of these two words, which, have their own meaning, but which put together combine to make, for example, the perfect passive tense, or the future perfect, whichever one you're using, is instead of saying amatus est, you can say est amatus. Latin loves playing around with word order to create emphasis, and I think I've told you before, emphasis is created in Latin where a word is in a position different to what you would expect. So verbs normally come at the end of their clauses, but if you bring the verb to the front of the clause, it puts huge emphasis on it. Similarly, subjects come before objects, but again, if you reverse that, you are creating emphasis. So you'll start seeing sentences now, such as, something like milites sunt superati, instead of milites superati sunt. Okay, it's just creating a little different kind of flavour to the sentence. The other thing that you can do now that we've got this concept is you can start leaving out the part of the verb to be. Now, just think about what happens in English. We often say something like, we might say something like, the soldiers were overcome and forced to flee. Okay, now did you see what happened there? Instead of saying the soldiers were overcome and were forced to flee, we left out the were. So the soldiers were overcome and forced to flee. We know exactly what that means, and actually it sounds much less cumbersome than the soldiers were overcome and were forced to flee. Exactly the same happens in Latin. So you could have milites superati sunt et fugere coacti sunt. Okay, perfectly normal sentence. But you can make it just a little bit more stylish by leaving out the verb to be. And in Latin, you leave it out on the first verb, not the second. So that would have been milites superati et fugere coacti sunt. Okay, so the sunt you would have had twice, but you only use it once, and it's much, much more stylish that way. Now, if you want to be even fancier than that, you can leave out the word et as well. Now, we'll do this when we get into book 3 and we really start motoring with past participles. But just imagine what this might have meant. Milites superati fugere coacti sunt. Now, if you remember that superati literally means having been overcome, you should be able to work out that that means milites superati, the soldiers, having been overcome, fugere coacti sunt, were forced to flee. So it's quite neat. And in the passages of Latin that we're going to come across from now on, this sort of thing will start happening. Okay, so you're going to be looking for perfect passives and future perfect passives and pluperfect passives where the tense of the verb to be in one or more of the clauses in a long sentence will be left out. And when you leave out the verb to be, the expression to use is the verb to be is understood. Okay? It's not just left out. You didn't just forget it. You understood it. In other words, you kind of took it that your reader would know what you meant and you didn't need to say it. And that's exactly what we do in English when we say the soldiers were overcome and forced to flee. We don't need to say and were forced to flee. Okay? Right, now we obviously need to kind of practice this to see it in action. It'll make much more sense when you see it happening. So we are in book 2. We are on page 45 and we've got an exercise 5.7. The little jolly story of Manlius Torquatus, and if you've been watching the Roman history videos, you will know that there was a little misunderstanding between father and son when the father was the consul and the supreme commander of the Roman army, and his son was a brave, if rather hot-headed young chap who disobeyed his father to prove how brave he was. Brave he may have been, but he was also disobedient, and I'm afraid he paid the penalty for that. Okay, so this little passage tells us about that story. So we'll just have a little go at it now. So we've got Manlius Torquatus consul erat cum publio decio. Okay, pretty straightforward. Subject at the beginning, Manlius Torquatus. Manlius Torquatus consul erat, was consul, cum publio decio, with Publius Decius. Okay, they were the two consuls. Bellum autem cum Latinis Romani gerebant. The Romans were waging war with the Latins. Notice there quite a sort of cool little trick where the subject, normally we look at our verb first, we saw gerebant, and we would then expect to go to the beginning of the sentence to try and find a nominative plural. Well, if you'd done that, you'd have gone to the beginning of the sentence and you wouldn't have found a nominative plural. You'd have found bellum, which was our object. But at that point, you mustn't just assume, well, then the subject must have been they, because you've always got to keep scanning down the sentence, just checking whether or not there was a nominative. And there was, right in front of the verb. Okay, Romani gerebant. So the Romans were waging a war with the Latins. Olim Manlius milites vocavit et cum hostibus inquit pugnare non cupio. Okay, we've got another of these little things where there's direct speech inside inverted commas. We now know how to handle that. We kind of slice off the bits that are inside the inverted commas, deal with them separately, and then the stuff that's outside we also do separately. So we've got olim manlius milites vocavit, once upon a time, main verb vocavit, subject he, she, it, or a noun in the nominative singular, and we've got Manlius. So, once upon a time, Manlius called milites his soldiers. You can say his soldiers rather than the soldiers, it sounds better. And now we're going to hear what he said to them. Inquit, he said, okay, and then what did he say? Let's get this bit inside the inverted commas. Cum hostibus pugnare non cupio. Go to the verb, non cupio, I do not want. That's going to be followed, typically, it's going to be followed by an infinitive. I do not want to do something. And we've got pugnare. So, I do not want to fight. Cum hostibus, with the enemy. On we go. Said, eques Latinus Magna voce clamavit, Romani, inquit, pugnare non copiunt. Okay, first verb first, clamavit. He, she, it, or a noun in the nominative singular. Back to the beginning we go, and we find eques latinus, a Latin knight or horseman. Eques is a horseman. So, but a Latin horseman, magna voce, with a loud voice, with a big voice, clamavit, shouted. Now, what did he shout? Okay, we've got this little word inquit, just to, one introduces direct speech in Latin using inquit. It can mean he said, or he shouted, or whatever the appropriate term would be. So what did he shout? Romani pugnare non copiunt. The Romans do not want to fight. Romani Latinos timent. The Romans fear the Latins. Filius autem manlii tortati, verba eos audivit. The son, manlii torquati, those are genitives, the son of Manlius Torquatus, audivit, there's our verb, heard, verba, the words, that's neuter plural, accusative neuter plural, eius, of him, so the son of Manlius Torquatus heard his words. Gladius igitur capit et in hostes cuccurit. First verb first, capit, he, she, it, or a noun in the nominative singular, took. He took, back to the beginning to find a subject. There is not one, but there is gladium. So, igitur, therefore. Therefore, he took his sword and ran, cuccurit, into the enemy. Eques Latinus a Romano forti vulneratus et interfectus est. Now, this is one of these things I've been telling you about. So let's just see what happens here. Eques Latinus, that's our subject, nominative singular. The Latin horseman, a Romano forti, by the brave Roman, okay, ablative after the preposition are. Vulneratus. Now, what we were really expecting was vulneratus est, okay, so was wounded. But we've only got vulneratus, and then on it goes, vulneratus et interfectus est. So literally, wounded and was killed. So in English we would say was wounded and killed. In Latin they seem to say wounded and was killed. So they do it slightly differently to us, but it's exactly the same principle. The verb to be, instead of being used twice when you don't really need it to be because the subject is the same, you use it once, and the second time, or the other time, the verb to be is understood. Okay? Now the story goes on. I'm not going to spoil the story for you by carrying on with this, but I just wanted to show you an example of this understanding of the verb to be being used in action. Okay, so there's a good example of how the verb to be is being understood. The best practice that I can suggest for you is translating from English into Latin. And I'd really like you to have a crack at exercise 5.8. Really, really good practice, taking a passage of English and putting it into Latin. If you've got the answer book for this, you'll find a translation for you, so you can check your work against that. Really worth having a bash at going from English into Latin, particularly when you're doing a passage of English rather than just simple sentences. It really kind of focuses the brain if you can get the whole tone of a passage of English and put it into Latin, which of course has different structures. Really good practice. Can't recommend it highly enough. Don't forget your revision. I said it would be a good idea to keep on top of the revision. You now know 6 tenses, active and passive, for all the main conjugations and the irregular verb to be. Okay, so do make sure that if someone asks you to give the imperfect of moneo or the future perfect of audio or the future passive of rego, you'd be able to do those. Okay, it's worth just what I used to do at the beginning of a new term with my pupils that come back having forgotten everything over the holidays. I would just say, right, first lesson, we're going to write it all out. And, set the clock and say, off we go. Write out all 6 active tenses of amo and all 6 passive tenses of amo. And then move on and do the same with moneo and rego and audio and capio. So, not a silly idea to check you can do that. We've also got other things that we need to make sure we haven't forgotten. Our present infinitives, active and passive. So remember, for amo it's amare in the active, that means to love. But if you want to say to be loved, you need to go amari, change the E to an I. Monere becomes moneri. Reggere becomes regi. Audire becomes audieri. Capere becomes capi. Okay, so your infinitives, active and passive, make sure you haven't forgotten those. Nouns, you've got 5 declensions of nouns. First, second, third, fourth, fifth. Make sure you haven't forgotten how mensa goes, how annus and puer and magister and bellum go. There's a second declension. How rex and opus and civis and cubile go. Third declension nouns. Then make sure you haven't forgotten gradus and our little neuter friend genu. Gnu, 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 gnus, gnu, gnu. I mean, blimey, who would want to forget that? And finally, our 5th declension, race. Race, race, rem, rei, rei, rei. Race, 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 rarem, rebus, rebus. Okay, so make sure you've got your nouns sorted. We've got our pronouns, personal pronouns. Ego, tu, nos, and vos. Ego me, mehi, mihi, me. Tu te, tuitipite. Nos, nos, nostrum, nobis, nobis. Vos, vos, vestrum, vobis, vobis. Make sure you've got those nailed. We've got a demonstrative pronoun, is, er, id. Now, that one, blimey, we've quite recently learnt it. I wonder if you've managed to revise it. Is, er, id, eo, meam, id, eus, 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 ei, eo, ea, eo. Plural, ei, ei, ea, eus, ea, sea. Eorum, 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 eis, 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 eis. Okay, don't forget that little fella. What else have we done? We've done numerals. We can count from 1 to 20. Unus, duo, tres, quattro, quinque, sex, septem, octo, novem, decem. Undecim, duodecim, tredecim, quattordecim, quindecim, sedecim, septendecim, duodeviginti, undeviginti, and viginti. And we've got ordinals, 1st to 10th. Primus, secundus, tertius, quartus, quintus, sextus, septimus, octavus, nonus, decimus. Make sure you've got those nailed. We've got adjectives. Bonus. Now, bonus, you shouldn't really have any trouble with bonus because, as you know, its masculine goes like anus, its feminine goes like mensa, and its neuter goes like bellum. But just make sure you haven't forgotten how it goes. And, of course, vocabulary. Now, vocabulary is something you've just got to keep on top of. The more you translate in and out of Latin, the better you get at vocabulary. But just remember, in this book, we always give about 20 or so words every chapter. So, you've been learning lots of vocabulary as you go along. Do make sure that you've learnt that with all the information that you were given in the book. So just looking, for example, at vocabulary 5, which we want you to learn this during this chapter, you've got the Latin for a ship, for example. Now, navis, feminine, a ship. You've got to know all of that stuff. Don't just learn navis means a ship. Because as you know, you're going to need the genitive singular of navis. It's a 3rd declension noun, but you wouldn't know that really until someone gave you the genitive singular. And only when you know the genitive singular do you know its stem and therefore how it goes. Navis, navis, nawem, navis, nawi, nawe. Okay, and you need to know it's feminine because if an adjective is agreeing with it, it needs to agree with it in gender. Okay, what else have we got here? We've got the Latin for a foot soldier, pedes. So, pedes, peditis, masculine, a foot soldier. That's going to be going pedes, pedes, peditem, peditis, pediti, pedite, pedites, 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 peditum, peditibus, peditibus. Not to be confused with pace, pedis, masculine, of foot, which will be going pace, pace, pedem, pedis, pedi, pede, pedes, 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 pedum, pedibus, pedibus. Okay, so the learning of vocabulary involves learning everything given in these lists. With verbs, you know that involves learning the principal parts. And if you don't learn the principal parts, you will not be able to form the tenses correctly, nor will you be able to recognize them correctly. Okay, so you must learn the principal parts. Sorry to be a bit strict about this, but it really, really is important. You just can't kind of shortcut this system. You have to learn it properly. It's almost as easy to learn it properly as to kind of half learn it. So why don't you learn it properly, and then you'll always feel confident, both translating from Latin and translating into Latin. And it's jolly good for the brain. Okay, enough from me on that. I will see you back here on this channel in due course. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Drop me any comments if you're having any problems, and I will see you very soon.